Welcome to Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, hosted by me, Alexandria Miller. Strictly Facts teaches the history, politics, and activism of the Caribbean and connects these themes to contemporary music and popular culture. Wagwan Strictly Facts fam, thank you for tuning in. Today's show brings back to light something I briefly mentioned in one of our first episodes. I grew up with stories of my grandmother's various natural remedies. I think as Caribbean people, we often have a bush tea for everything. We go in our backyard, cut a piece, boil it, and use it to treat illnesses. And I'm not sure about all of you, but as a child, I was more concerned with oftentimes the bitter taste and less so with what it meant for our history and how it was healing me. But in our episode, today we'll be flipping that a bit, obviously, and analyzing how bush medicine is a critical part of our history. So, joining Strictly Facts today to talk more about this history is Dr. Julia Jordan-Zachery, professor and chair of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Wake Forest and the filmmaker and co producer of recent documentary Healing Roots. Welcome, Dr. Zachery. Please tell us a bit about yourself and where in the Caribbean is near and dear to you.
So thank you so much for having me. I think this is a really important podcast. So I want to salute you for taking the time to develop this and to really talk about our culture and the things that we have been able to maintain over time, space, and things like that. So commend you on that. So I am originally from Barbados and born and bred, and Barbados will always be home, even though I oftentimes smile and say I haven't lived there in forever, but it will always be home because it's always with me. And I think it's the same thing with kind of like bush medicine and the culture of bush medicine and stuff like that, right? It's always with us. So I, as you mentioned, am a professor. I have a PhD in political science, but have always been curious about women, Black women in particular, and how we navigate life, how we move through life, particularly when people are telling us no constantly. You can't have, you can't do, you can't be. And I'm like, but we've always found a way to be.
Beautiful. I'm so grateful to have you on this episode. And so, first off, bush medicine is there, I think, are a lot of ways people frame the conversation, a lot of terminologies, traditional medicine, handmade medicine, herbalism, etc. But in your sort of own understanding, and especially through the documentary, could you talk about what exactly is bush medicine and how it's linked directly to Caribbean history?
So in the documentary Healing Roots, right, I take up this question of how women, Black Barbadian women in particular, use the earth, use the things of the earth to heal, and not just heal physically the human body, but also heal cultures, right? Because as I try to portray in the documentary, in Barbados, these bush women, these individuals that use bush medicine, and it's interesting that it's typically tied to women, right? And maybe it's the oral component of it, etc. These women have a lot of knowledge and knowledge that kind of, I oftentimes say Black women have this beautiful way of bending time. So this knowledge allows us to bend time going back centuries and centuries, right? So I try a little bit to explore that in the documentary, and there's still so much more to explore and to do. In Barbados, we've historically called it bush medicine, and it makes sense why you would call it bush medicine because you're using bush, leaves, whether it's a soursop tree leaf, searchy bush, those types of things. But you asked me this question about how it speaks to Caribbean culture, which is something that I'm hoping to explore in the near future. I came to this project because as a young girl in school in Barbados, I remember just reading how enslaved individuals didn't reproduce, right? And so the colonizers had to bring in individuals to help maintain the institution of slavery. And I always had that question like, what were these women doing that they did not reproduce? Right? I'm still fascinated by that. And of course, we don't have the stories of these women because they're not written down in books and things. But and there's a law, and I can't remember the timing of the law. It really started in Jamaica, where they outlawed the use of bush medicine and obey, right? And made it this law that if you practice this, that you would be penalized and punished. And eventually, that made its way to Barbados and things like, and I'm assuming all over the Caribbean. But these women still found a way to circumvent that law and not reproduce. How did they do this? They had to be using some type of herb, some type of bush, as we call it in Barbados, right? To control their bodies. And so I think that bush medicine is intimately tied to resistance against slavery and the erasure of of the knowledge, because when you read about the institution of slavery, oftentimes, what we now consider Black people are often constructed as not having knowledge. But yet in the Caribbean, being stolen from the continent of Africa, coming to the Caribbean, using bush medicine to resist slavery tells us a different story, right? And I think that's ultimately why I am so fascinated by our use of bush medicine.
What you were saying about Jamaica even brought to mind me thinking about Cuba Cornwallis, who was a Jamaican healer, and whose story is very interesting. But to sort of get to the point in terms of our conversation, her efforts and practices as a healer and a doctoress in the 18th and 19th centuries was belittled, and to your point about Obia mistaken for witchcraft, especially
Mm-hmm.
by these colonial powers. And I think that also, in tandem with the idea of bush medicine as being resistance, it also highlights this sort of stigma against natural medicines and natural remedies that I think, in a sense, what you're talking about also speaks to the fact that when things have been created, developed, etc., by Black people, they're oftentimes pitted as wrong or bad,
Mm-hmm.
etc. And so I think that conversation, I think, always has bewildered me when we're thinking of what is bush medicine and all the healing properties and knowledge from that comparatively to like Western medicine, which is always typically quote unquote seen as supposed to be well and good and scientific and well reasoned, right? Another point that you made that I was, really struck through from your documentary is this fact of ancestral knowledge being brought through from bush medicine and how it is so significantly tied to women. And so, could you speak to how bush medicine is can be seen as that sort of ancestral knowledge that the women in your documentary are using now today, and how that ties to generations upon generations of Black women healers.
Right. So one of the things that they often in the documentary that's mentioned is, oh, I learned this from my mother and my mother, or she would send me down the street to so and so, who happened to be a woman, and she would tell me, girl, pick this bush, pick that bush, you know. And I also think of like my childhood. I remember the first time, you mentioned the bitter taste. I remember the first time my mother ever gave me Surshey Bush. I was like, what is this? I'm like, please don't give me this again. I will never be sick again for the rest of my life. But where did she get that knowledge? Well, she got that knowledge from her grandmother, whom I never met because her grandmother died when she was 8, right? But here she is giving me this little bit of knowledge that her grandmother left with her. So when we think about legacy, a lot of times we think about legacy as leaving material things. But there's this rich, rich, rich legacy that's passed on through oral tradition, through, something like go in the backyard and pick so and so and bring. Give me 2 leaves here, a leaf there. It's not written down. Like I just lost her name, the older lady in the documentary. She was a hoot, by the way. So I asked her, how do you know how to put things together, right? She goes, girl, I didn't know how to put things together. I just go with, the spirit almost, right? And so, but that spirit that she's kind of referencing is actually this kind of ancestral knowledge that exists in a tangible way, and sometimes in a way that Western philosophic thought doesn't allow us to think about the transmission of knowledge, right? That sometimes it's just there. So I get laughed at a lot in my family because they always say, she old as ever. I don't know where the knowledge came from. You know what I mean? Because it's not like my mom necessarily taught me some of the things that I know. But somewhere along the line through the generations, there's something that exists. So, my family will call me, oh, so and so don't feel good, blah, blah, blah. What should they do? I'm like, girl, give her this, blah, blah, blah. And they're like, okay. I don't know how I know it, right? It's not like I started studying, but when I look back, I've always been this way my entire life, right? So I think, to kind of just give this a little framing, I think part of it is the oral tradition that allows, and women tend to be caregivers, whether it's our nature or simply society forcing us to be caregivers. And so because we're caregivers, that kind of knowledge gets passed down on how to care for people, especially when certain resources aren't available. Right. And you got to care for your child. You got to care for your family. The other day I stepped on a nail. So everybody's like, you got to tetanus shot. I was like, well, I use some candle grease and I use, right. I'll eventually get to Western medicine. But what did I do? Immediately, without thinking about it, I went right to the stuff that's in my cabinet, right? And so I think that there's that oral tradition, but I think there's something else that Western thought simply does not give us the language to articulate about how Black women know things, if that makes sense.
No, I agree. I think that was beautifully said. I think, especially in my own sort of studies and looking at the wide definition of what is resistance, right? I had an episode many, many moons ago about dress, right, and fashion, and how, even in looking at some of the laws during enslavement in the Code Noir, the way that head wraps and different fashions become a sense of Black women's resistance, right? Resistance and knowledge isn't just these big markers that they've been made to be, but there are other spiritual ways, ancestral ways that we can't necessarily describe in the most tangible sense, or they don't have this quote unquote lofty um presentation, but they mean so much to us in the way that our people have been able to exist, thrive, and survive over the
Exactly.
centuries. I was gonna wait till later, but I was going to eventually ask, what are some of your favorite, healing roots and properties?
So, it varies. It varies on where I am in life and what I need. So I'm a huge fan of lemongrass. In Jamaica, y'all call it fever grass. So I grow it in my backyard and dry it and I'll be giving it away to people. Here, keep this for the winter. you know. Um I told you I'm that old person. But lemongrass is something that I keep. And I also keep rosemary. I use a lot of rosemary and ginger recently. I don't know if it's related to COVID, but I love to add those to your bath, right? And we touch a little bit about on this in the documentary that, baths were important. And you're talking about people that didn't have the luxury of having bathtubs and all this stuff, right? But they found ways to use baths as a way of getting rid of stuff. And so, and I get this from my grandmother because I remember her ritual was every Sunday before she left for church, she would fill the tub and fill it with Epsom salts and stuff like that. And that's also a staple in my house, right? Epsom salt. And everybody knew not to bother my gran when Sunday morning when she's in the bath. I don't know what that woman did, but you would hear her humming in the water. And it was to me one of the most gentle kind of moments that I got to witness, not witness in the sense of being there in the bathroom, but witness my grand engage in. But that's been part of the tradition, I think, of African descended women, right? Is to use these ritual baths. And they can be simple. I think, sometimes capitalism takes us away from the simplicity and the value of the ritual and makes it into something else, right? But my grandmother always kept these baths really simple, and so to me they became something very sacred. And so I have different herbs and stuff like that, depending on the season of the year, depending on the season of my life that I would use. So rosemary, like I said, has become really kind of important for me. Again, I don't know why. I really have come to the point of trusting my body and my spirit enough to know what it needs. Right. I also use nettle a lot too. And I've stopped asking why. For me, why is oftentimes not a valid question, but more how. How do I meet myself where I am in this moment? And that's the thing about bush medicine, right? They had a knowledge to know how to meet the individual where they were, and everybody didn't need everything.
Your point on capitalism really brought me to my next question, especially because I think in this sort of new age of like self-care and all of these things, there are ways that at least what I've seen as our traditional ways of healing are being like commodified,
Mhm.
um and oftentimes not with us as the face,
Mm.
as like the creators or people who have espoused this knowledge. And so could you talk about how you see bush medicine and western medicine not even just, working in tandem with each other, but, opposite of each other, and how the prevalence of Western medicine is affecting the Caribbean and its diaspora.
Mhm. So one of the women in the documentary kind of talks about that, right? She talks about how the kind of use of modern medicine, what we consider to be modern medicine, which is oftentimes based on bush medicine, right? Take the properties of some of the plants, etc., and synthesize them, and produce pills and things like that. And I'm not knocking modern medicine. I think there's a place for it, right? But I also think there's a place for the knowledge that comes from bush medicine as a way of curing. All right. So in my mind, I oftentimes don't necessarily see them as having to be at war. But sometimes it's complementary. You have to know your body, is what I always say. You kind of sort of have to really kind of know your body. And you have to have somebody that you trust that can help you figure out which herbs, etc., works for certain things, right? And so I always say be open to these possibilities. But I think, when we think about modern medicine and this notion of industrialization of the Caribbean, what it has meant is that, and this comes up in the documentary too, is all of the places we saw the native plants that we would just tap into are now gone, right? Because they've been cemented over. And so you can't easily just go outside and pick something or walk the road and pick something because it's just growing, you know? And so that's what I'm concerned about as we move towards this notion of development. And that development has been so defined by people external to us. And so, what would happen if we in the Caribbean thought about development through our lens? What would it look like? Where would they be space for the things that we have held on to when colonialism tried to beat it, literally and figuratively beat it out of us, right? So, how do we preserve our native plants? How do we teach our children? Which is why I try to make this documentary the way I did, the length I did, right? How do we begin to teach our children that the hibiscus, now everybody's running around buying hibiscus tea. I'm like, we just drink that in Barbados, right? And y'all want to sell that for how many a pack? Y'all gotta be losing your mind, you know? Um, but how do we begin to ensure that future generations have this knowledge and not only have the knowledge but take pride in it and not thinking that it's lesser than but equal to? And that's my concern with modern medicine, is that we privilege it the same way we privilege at times colonial religion, even though they took a lot of our stuff. Like, I always make fun. And so people will say, "Oh, you worshiping the devil because you burn sage." I'm like, but the Catholic Church be coming down the aisle burning what? Where do you think they got that from? They got that from indigenous people. But they done told you that it's because it's to their God that that's legitimate. But if you burn the same thing, it's illegitimate. I'm like, come on, think about this. Think about this. There's no hierarchy in knowledge. That part just cracks me up, right? So you see all these people like on Instagram and stuff. Oh, y'all worshiping the devil, but your church don't be burning stuff, right? And so I just think we ought to be critical consumers of information. And more importantly, we ought to think about how we value our knowledge that is unique to us in the Caribbean, that is deeply, deeply, deeply Afrocentric.
The point that you're making brings me to my next question. And I think one piece of the documentary that I found really beautiful was the sort of intergenerational conversations you were espousing, right? And I think oftentimes when we think of bush medicine, we're thinking of our grandmothers, et cetera, right? But you have such a range of who you've interviewed in these discussions, and including young people. And so, could you talk about what are your hopes for the future generations and even those living in the diaspora who may be considering these practices and trying to figure out just how to tap into this ancestral knowledge that, as you've beautifully said, is rightfully ours and it has been ours for many centuries?
Talk to each other. Now I'm going to sound like my age, right? But sometimes it's okay to turn off the TV. It's okay to put the phone down, stop scrolling, that type of thing, right? And take the opportunity to talk to, those older people in your neighborhoods, right? So Russ Isles talked about, how he had to go inward in order to come out. So he talked about going into the cave. And, he to me, he said something that was so beautiful. He said on the outside, he just looked like this crazy Rasta man, but he had to shut out the noise in order to tap into that knowledge. And no, we don't necessarily have to go to the cave, physical cave, but sometimes we have to begin to shut out the external in order to come deep in the inside so that we can come back out. And a way of doing that is to have conversations with individuals, right? So, like, Gran, why do you always put Epsom salts in your bath? Well, try like come along doing that. Because they say, the salts draw things out of you and helps you to let go. You know what I mean? And so talk to these individuals and you will find that, that person in your community who everybody says, oh, she's just a strange one, has so much beautiful knowledge and is willing to share. You just have to humble yourself a little bit and not assume that you are better than that person and just come sit at their knees, right? Just sit at the knees of the people that have this knowledge. And then, more importantly, don't just sit at their knees because it values you, but then give it away to somebody else. And I think that's my hope. That's my dream is that when people see this documentary, they're going to become intrigued by, oh, yeah, I remember so and so used to do A, or my grandmother used to give me this, and spend a little time thinking, looking, don't just use the internet to look up certain things, but maybe start using it to say, okay, what is this herb good for? What is this bush good for?
Beautifully said. Thank you so much for that. I agree. I'm thinking of the ways that, you know, even in my own family, how I think I've been doing that, sitting by the knee and learning. But I think there's that step forward that you mentioned, which is and then share it with others, right? And so thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
So my last question, my favorite question of all, what are some of the ways you see bush medicine and in pop culture, whether that's been through music, through dance, through performance, through novels, etc.?
Right, right. I think it shows up in ways that we don't always um pay attention to. Like I think of what's her name? Brand.
Dion Brand.
story. Yes. Right. Shows up beautifully in Brand's work, right? These little moments where she's like, yeah, look how they use this. Look how they use the Orishas. Look how they, and they bring and why I think I like how she does it is that she brings it to the diaspora, right? So you see it pop up in Canada and the stories around immigration in Canada, for example. So Marlon James's book, The Book of Night Women, really captures the use of bush medicine. I think is also holds so much, and I've seen so many people analyze Book of Night Women, and they don't really talk about the use of bush medicine in Book of Night Women, right? So, like using the green, as we were saying, Barbados, papaya, all right? I have to convert it to US, but how they use like the green papaya to kind of, and I don't know if this works. So, folk out there listening, do not tell, not know if this works, to make sure that she never becomes impregnated, and the way that they use the bush when and we see it in Alice Walker's work, right, when she talks about how the women bathe between her thighs with bush medicine to restore her after being brutally raped by white men, right? And you see this across the African diaspora, how they just tap into the use of bush medicine, the use of the earth, right? To kind of come back to self. And I think that's why I'm so drawn to it, is that not only does it necessarily heal, but it also gives the individual an opportunity to kind of come back to who they are. So it's restorative in that way, right? And to me, that's the beauty of it. And it's kind of a masculinist text, which makes me smile about actually liking it. But the Book of Night Women, I think, is one of is up there in terms of how he deploys bush medicine throughout the book. Right? I'm like, what's keeping Nanny alive? She done been shot. She went through a fire. But where does she go? To the bush, right? Where do you find her? In the bush, right? So that's probably in terms of cultural representations. For me, it's just beautiful. I could think of others, but for me, that one stands out the most.
Beautiful. Thank you. And I love that book as well. Oyago. Stay tuned for Strictly Facts Sounds, where we connect our history to pop culture. Pairing Dr. Jordan-Zachery's literary recommendations, we're sharing two songs, a throwback and a super throwback, as part of our episode on bush medicine. Chronix's 2014 song Spirulina talks about all the roots he's blending up because your medicine is your food. Check that out, but also check out our super throwback. How many of you remember the folk song about Elena? As it goes, Elena start bow our belly. And what was her cure? The ever healing but ever bitter Circe plant. Check out both songs online and let us know what you learned from this episode. So that's it for our conversation today. Thank you so much, Dr. Jordan-Zachery, for joining us. The links to Healing Roots and more about Dr. Jordan-Zachery will be in our show notes, and we hope you all enjoyed this episode a little more. Thanks for tuning in to Strictly Facts. Visit strictlyfactspodcast.com for more information from each episode. Follow us at Strictly Facts Pod on Instagram and Facebook, and at Strictly Facts PD on Twitter.